Welcome to the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast, where we discuss topics related to sterile and non-sterile compounding pharmacy in an effort to promote compliance and increase quality. The Pharmacy Inspection Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, delivering quality and meaningful conversations and discussions about our pharmacy industry and the critical role pharmacists play in our healthcare systems. Learn more at pharmacypodcast.com. Please welcome your hosts, Brian Prince and Seth DePasquale.
I've been waiting for this revision to come out for quite some time, just like a lot of you, back in 2015 when the first draft of it came out. It's weird to think, I guess all of us pharmacy nerds think about it kind of like Christmas in a weird way. But yeah, I got to see that first draft and have eagerly been awaiting the second version to come out. So this is the one where folks made comments on, to my knowledge, it was commented on, chapter in USP history. It took a lot of time to get these comments and rewrite, but yeah, I was glad to read this Friday and glad to share a little bit of my insights with you guys and chat with you and Brian today, because that's always a fun pleasure.
Yeah, we appreciate you joining us, John. This is the dawn of a new day for us, man. This is the first time that we've been able to carry this live. We've always done it on the backside, been able to edit. So now we've got to make sure that we can do this in one take. But this is kind of wonderful technology that we get to jump in. And John's right, us pharmacy nerds, I can tell you this, I was on a little bit of a mini vacation last week, and so when it got released, all of the other consultants, they were jumping in. I was part of an email string, and I know, John, you were part of that also. And it was like Christmas morning. People were, commenting back and forth. It got to a point where almost the emails were overwhelming. And I know for the pharmacy community, you guys may not be as excited as we are, but whenever some of these things come down the pipeline, the market kind of looks to us to kind of delineate, disseminate, and almost, pull the pieces apart. And that's why we're here today. We want to talk about some of the pieces and the parts. And what are those hot buttons? Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able to hit everything, because I think we're going to try to limit the time. Typically with our podcast, we try to stay within 25 minutes. This one may actually go a little bit longer. This may lead into, session 2, session 3, whatever it turns out to be. But I tell you what, I'm not going to consume this. I'm going to let the two real pharmacy nerds, Seth and John, jump in. Seth, what are one of those hot buttons that you really wanted to discuss on your end? And of course, with live technology, we're going to have probably technology breakdowns, which I guess isn't too surprising. So I'll tell you what, let me flip that back over to John and say, John, hit me with one of your hot buttons that you saw that kind of jumped out to you that you'd like to discuss first.
Gosh, where to even begin? just generally speaking, I would say that the chapter, this version of it, it points pharmacies, or I should rephrase that. It's where I know us at PCAP have been pointing pharmacies for quite some time. There's a lot of things in current 797 that are, they're either misunderstood, they're misinterpreted. There's references used that, they're buried down in footnotes, or they're way back in the back in some of the appendices and things like that. And, I've been really happy that the chapter came out and you made it much more readable, more understandable, pointed out better where those things came from. Using CETA, for example, that's just blatantly put in there. It's not buried in a footnote. So, I have to applaud USP for that, at creating a much better document. And then I'm also real happy that a lot of the stakeholder comments were taken into account. I know something that Seth wanted to talk about was some of the differences between the previous draft that was out there and the current one, and I have to say they're huge. I mean, there's some pretty significant things in there, things like training, things like viable air sampling that pulled back very much from the first draft, and some of those things that concern pharmacies both from a workflow perspective and a financial perspective. So I'll be glad to get to those in a minute. Seth, are you back on with us?
Yeah, I was just texting with him, and he said that he thought his mic was on mute. So just so you know, Seth is he's actually on vacation this week, and he's trying to get connectivity, so he may be in and out. But John, go ahead and feel free to go ahead and jump in and carry your thoughts downstream.
Oh man, this is not how it was supposed to go. Right?
Hey, welcome to the Jon Show, the Jon Pritchet Show. This is what it's all about today. It's all about you. We appreciate you joining us. So, like I said, carry it on downstream.
Holy cow. All right, well, I'm going to go into a couple of things that Seth had actually pointed out. So, let's do this. Actually, guys, listening, if you're doing the live podcast and paying attention, hopefully you've got a copy of this already. So, first things first, if you have not downloaded the new chapter and taken a look at it, I want you to do that. So, you can go to USP's website and first off, get signed up. They do have a link available where you can get locked in for updates on the chapter. And there's more than just 797, so it'll give you updates on sterile compounding. Obviously, there's stuff with 795 for non-sterile. That's undergoing revision, just like 797 has. And also, if you're into the radio world, radio pharmaceuticals, we've got the new chapter 825 that's open for comments. So first off, I suggest you go and get this. You can download the revisions for free right now. So, if you're part of the PCAP family, you should have access to USP standards. But if you're not PCAP accredited, you may not have that yet. Go on and get the chapter. It's something that I heard mentioned, and I believe Seth actually maybe on one of the last couple of podcasts said, is if he's looking for something with USP, a lot of times he'll Google it and find something. And I cringed a little bit when I heard that, because USP does make changes, and there's different versions of them out there, and a lot of times the stuff that you find online is something that's posted and it's not up to date anymore. So make sure you get the current version of this and take a look at it. And I think with what we've seen with this revision, I mentioned this earlier, but it seems like USP took a lot of the comments and took them to heart. So just so that you guys are familiar, when you get the revision, it'll actually come with each line numbered. And what you have the ability to do is go by the numbers and make comments back to USP, and they actually do read all those. My understanding was that USP actually had to hire 2 additional staff people to read the many comments that you guys put out there. So, and again, the great news is they were read and they were put into play in a lot of situations. So I'll try to hit on some of those now. Hopefully Seth will be able to get back on and join me, but if not, we'll just kind of comb through and look at them.
Yeah, he's trying to join us now. Like I said, he's having connectivity issues being remote out of his office.
Yeah.
So we'll just be patient and eventually.
Yeah, that non-reliable Starbucks Wi-Fi.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's technology. Like I said, this is the first time we've done the live, and as I understand it on the other end, I'm getting some texts, is that the sound quality, John, is not great. So there's a lot of background noise. I don't know where it's coming from because it's completely quiet here in my home office, and I don't hear so much in your as well. So if you could just get a little bit closer to whatever mic system you're using, John, kind of put your face on it. And
I wish y'all could see me now.
Maybe that'll clean it up a little bit on your end. But anyway, if you've got a topic, one of those pivot points, go ahead and jump in on it.
Yeah. So, the thing, let's remember the scope of the chapter first off. We're talking sterile compounding, and we're just talking non-hazardous right now. So one of the big changes, and we knew this was coming, is that current 797 today, it deals with hazardous drugs. It talks about negative pressure rooms and class 2 BSCs and closed system transfer devices, all that fun stuff. That's completely removed from the chapter, and 797 now, at least in this revision, it refers you to 800. So we get a lot of questions about when's 800 going to be enforced, when's it in play, that type of thing. You really, if this chapter goes through as is, you end up not being able to avoid the 800 question when this is all in full effect. So know that is still very much a thing. Another thing that's a little different with the chapter, the first version of the 797 revision, and actually today, in current 797, you can have an isolator in a non-ISO room and be compliant with higher risk levels of compound, as long as you do some extra testing on it defined by the chapter. What we have now, though, is all primary engineering controls need to be basically in a clean room. So if you have an isolator that's outside of that space, you can either need to think about building the room around it or moving it into that room. A couple of things about requirements for the room. The chapter, in this version of it, it did back down from what was in the first version. So, a good example there is viable air sampling. So right now, 797 requirement on that is every obviously that comes at a price for the pharmacy. To purchase an impact sampler, you need to have somebody trained in how to use it. You have to make sure it's calibrated. That is backed down in the revision. So I know a lot of you can breathe a little easier on that one. So it remains where your non-viable and your viable hair sampling is at every 6 months in this version. We also get a clarification on surface sampling. So with surface sampling today in USP, it really doesn't give you the time frame for it. I'm not sure if that was an error when the chapter was written, but now there's a requirement for doing it monthly. Pretty significant change there. I'll go ahead and actually, since we're talking about categories, let's talk a little bit about beyond use states. So I mentioned earlier that things that are done in a segregated compounding area, this category 1 of sterile compounding, those get a 24-hour refrigerated or 12-hour room temp BUD, and that's pretty cut and dry and straightforward. And that's usually used in a situation where you're going to have relatively fast administration. So a lot of times that's going to be something like, an ambulatory infusion center, some sort of physician dispensing suite where you're doing everything on site. So that'll work in those situations. But for most of the pharmacies that I know I work with through our accreditation programs, you're dealing with outpatient type stuff. You're dealing with either home infusion type things. You might be doing high risk compounding where you're making things for people and animals. And so you're going to fall in that category 2 area. And so looking at the original table, so when I say table 12, if you've got the document open to 797, this is line 1672 is where this begins. So the first revision of this chapter for setting BUDs gave us a huge table that you went by, and it broke things down by how they were prepared, whether it was aseptic or terminal sterilization. It went through whether you had a sterility test done. It went through whether you had a preservative added. It went through your starting components, whether they were sterile or non-sterile. And it created a rubric that was fairly confusing. And 2, most compounders found it fairly limiting. In current 797 today, we have our beyond use states for low, medium, and high risk applications. And then there's steps that we can go through to extend the beyond use state. So that'll include sterility testing, maybe endotoxin, depending on the size of the batch, and then a justification for that longer beyond use state. In the first revision of 797, we had a change there of maximum beyond use states. So in most situations, I think the longest BUD you could get on anything was at a frozen temperature was 45 days. And then in a lot of cases, it was 28 to 42 days, depending on sterility testing and that sort of thing. But it looked like it was going to make larger scale production of sterile compounds very difficult. And I can say that with this revision, it's been peeled back a bit. We still have the same kind of format where we look at aseptically prepared CSPs, we look at terminally sterilized CSPs. We don't jump through quite so many things. So just to give you an idea, I'm looking at this, and I always think about, what are the common compounds that our guys are working with. So let's just use Trimix as an example. A lot of you guys doing high risk compounding, you're working with something like this. So the way you walk through that is it aseptically prepared or is it terminally sterilized? And by the way, terminally sterilized means you're killing it in the final container. So filtration is an aseptic preparation. It's not terminal sterilization. But that would be an aseptically prepared product. And then we ask ourselves the question, is sterility testing performed and passed? If we said no, and you did no sterility testing, and we had a non-sterile starting component, we'd give ourselves 4 days refrigerated on that. However, if we are doing sterility testing, and refrigerated, we could get a 45-day beyond use state, and freezer actually 60 days. So we're expanded out a little bit with that. So I'm not going to delve into that a whole lot more, but that was something that, it's certainly a relief from where we were before. And again, I know a lot of you hear that, and that's very different than what you're doing today. So again, go through the process. We've seen that it does work, and comments are taken in. So that'd be something I'd certainly take a close look at, and make your comments known to USP, and don't just rely on some of your trade organizations to do that. Make sure you do that on your own. A couple of other things on there. So let's get into, I'm just flipping through my notes here. Training and competency. So something that I like about the way this is written is there's a lot of confusion out there about training and competency. I can tell when we run statistics on our PCAB surveys, what do we usually run into issues with? And typically that's in the top 2 or 3 items. And usually it's a function of, one, people don't understand that there's a difference between training and competency assessment. And then it's honestly, when you read the chapter, the current 797, it's a little bit difficult to figure out what are the various assessments I need to do, and when do I need to do them. And I think this version really explains that a lot better. It kind of defines things like glove fingertip testing. When does it need to occur? So you have like your initial gowning and gloving sampling you do, then you have your sampling after media fill. And it just gives much more granular information of what that looks like, and what you should see with it. So I applaud the folks over at USP for stepping that up a little bit. Another thing that I found interesting is the area where hand washing occurs is not spelled out in this chapter. So right now we talk about doing it in the ante room. And I can tell you again, as we've done surveys, not every pharmacy is constructed the same. And sometimes getting a sink in an ante room can be difficult. You get into issues of, can we run water lines and drains? Do we even want a sink in there? Do we have another space in the pharmacy? I find it interesting that in GMP land, very rarely is hand washing ever done in the ante room. Typically, it's done in its own dedicated space. So that
that is definitely one of the points that the FDA does not like. They do not like to see sinks inside of an ante room. And then oftentimes, if you think about a modular clean room, it's positioned typically right in the middle of a space, right? You don't want to put a clean room up against an exterior wall, because then you got to deal with all the heat and the moisture. And if it's in the middle, then if you've got a drain, then you've got to come in and you've got to trench out that concrete. So there's always that sink, just to your point, the sink is always the huge caveat. And then if it is a very small ante room at some of the smaller community pharmacies, you can't get it, 3 feet away and then away from another door. So there's so many variables as it relates to the sink. But I found it interesting that they actually said that they don't want it next to a primary engineering control. When I thought to myself, wait a minute, what does that mean? Because at first that was confusing to me. And I get it. If they're talking about a segregated compound area, I get what they're saying there, that they don't want the sink inside of that line of demarcation or that demarcated area. I get all that. But the way that it read initially to me was very confusing, saying, okay, you don't want a sink next to a primary engineering control. Yeah, well, we get that. And I guess maybe they're assuming that if somebody's doing like pre-sterilization weighing or something and there's a hood beside it. I mean, I kind of get it, but it just, to me, it was a little bit ambiguous.
Yeah. And I think where they're headed, and this is just me thinking out loud, so I could be wrong about this, but it's wanting pharmacies to validate their own processes. It's not, let's prescribe for you one method and then you've got to figure out how to fit it into this box. It's more, you come up with your method and you validate that. And this is something we talk with pharmacies about a lot too, is show us that process works. You have the ability. I mean, we do this, initial gloving and garbing competency on our sterile compounders really once, going by current chapter, and we don't necessarily have to repeat that. And that's something that a glove fingertip test doesn't take a lot of effort. It doesn't cost a lot to do. And that's something you can use to validate your process and show data of this person can get into this room. We have this kind of data to back it up. And I think that's really what they're trying to steer people towards, is really validate that process. So again, I think that was a good thing and a nice change. Kind of going along that line too, just something I made a note on is there's been a lot of confusion about what's the proper way to gown if you're using an isolator. So a containment aseptic isolator or a khaki, the kind that's used for hazardous drugs, but it gives granularity on the gloving for that. So it talks about using a disposable glove inside the gauntlet and then a sterile glove over the gauntlet glove. So that's always been a point of contention for a lot of pharmacies. Now we've got a little more guidance on that to point it out.
Can you guys hear me?
Hey!
Boom! Sorry about that, guys.
Seth, thanks for joining us, buddy.
Hey, no problem. Yeah. Was there something going on today? Were we going live or something?
Well, actually, we're just wrapping up, so we'll talk to you later.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And if either one of you got also playing the audio in the background, it is kind of echoing a little bit. And I'm getting kind of a barrage of texts saying, hey, there's a lot of feedback here or something like that. And I think I was making the mistake earlier. I was texting next to my microphone, so there's probably some feedback there. So to the audience, we apologize for some of the technical difficulties. But Seth, why don't you join in?
Yeah, we were just talking about how the, John brought up the point of having people validate their own processes and procedures. And I feel like I was thinking about this on the way over here, that USP is aligning to some degree with FDA. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think if there's practices out there that are the best thing to do and we can learn from big pharma, there's actually, I'm all for that. It's definitely it should be part of our continuous quality improvement mindset anyway. In that, I think, there are going to be more and more of these validations that we're going to have to figure out how to do. And like John said, we already do this. You just have to think about it in a different way, not where we're trying to get information from the USP and guide us and give us direction, but we're going to have to figure out our own practices and procedures and what works absolutely the best, and then prove that it works the best. And that's the way to go about going forward with, anything that you're doing in the pharmacy, whether it's has to do with compounding or even shipping out the packages and that kind of stuff. All that stuff comes into play when we're talking about quality improvement. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of things in USP 797, this revision in particular, that read really well. I think that they did a really good job they're doing more educating, I feel like. You had just talked about the sinks in your ante room, and I kind of applauded that because, it just honestly makes a lot of sense. The basis for life is the fact that there's water around, and if you're taking the water out of the equation, then it lowers that risk of contamination just a little bit. What do you guys think about how they're trying to get people to think about the beyond use dates? And what I mean there is that they've really boiled it down to a list of 5 things, where depends on your environment in which the CSP is prepared, the aseptic preparation and the sterilization method. John, you had touched on terminal sterilization, and there's a difference obviously in terminal versus filtration. And then 3 other things: components and ingredients, whether you're starting with non-sterile ingredients, whether or not sterility testing is being performed, and storage conditions, meaning packaging and temperature. A lot of this stuff was already talked about, but I really feel like they've hammered it home in a couple sections within this proposed revision. What are your thoughts on that, John?
My thoughts on the Beyond You states themselves.
How they're sort of coming up with the formula, I guess, if you will, and educating people on why they're coming up with that. Those 5 points that I just kind of mentioned.
I don't know where the numbers are coming from. They're not nearly as stringent as what we saw in the first draft. So we're moving in the right direction. And I think there's some level of a goal of preventing large scale production. Compounders that look more like a manufacturer, I really think they want to get away from that. We do know that the FDA was part of the expert committee. And to your point earlier, Seth, some of these things we're doing look a little more FDA-like. And I agree with you. In some situations, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not a huge fan of maximum Beyond You states. I do like just personally the idea that through the proper testing and validation of the process, one could extend a little bit longer. I find this current BUD table is certainly more workable. I'm thinking of things, when I was still practicing that I compound, could I fit it into this rubric? And the answer is yes. You'd have a few more hoops to jump through, but it's more doable. I do think that when you get a little further, I think it's in section 14, the use of CSPs as components, something that's not addressed in current 797 right now, or these intermediary things that we use as stock solutions that are compounded. And today, a lot of folks will compound things and do sterility testing on that intermediate component. And we didn't really have clear guidance on that. And now we have better guidance. There is a section that talks about it, but it limits compounded stock solutions, I believe, down to 6 hours after initial entry or puncture.
Yeah, that is actually, I'm getting nervous. Apologies for that.
Something else I want to talk about, Seth, is formulation records. So a lot of people are not aware of this, but current 797 actually has very little to say about formulation records. So a lot of it's coming from a community pharmacy background, especially if we did non-sterile compounding or we were doing high-risk sterile compounding. We were used to maintaining basically the same kind of records that are spelled out in 795. And years ago, there used to be a linking between 795 and 797. And so it made sense to use 795's criteria for master formulation records and compounding records. But that was severed, I think, in 2012. And going forward, there's been some confusion. Now, to me, it makes perfect sense to have detailed formulation records for high-risk compounds, or if you're making things in batch, you need traceability. But I know a lot of things like hospitals, it was difficult to keep a formulation record. So if you consider something just like IV admixtures compounding, which depending on the definition of compounding that you use, them coming up with a formulation record for every single thing they did, I'm not industry has been headed over the last few years, where if you're making IV bags and you're following the package insert, then there's not necessarily a need to keep that information. But if you're doing that, we call this a wrap, and either we record what we wanted this to sound like and put it out, or we set up another time, and maybe when Seth's not hanging out at Starbucks, and let's see if we can get this to pan out better. What do you